Welcome to The Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist oppression and investigate alternative ways of living for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1 FM. It is your local community radio station. My name is Andy and I will be with you for the next hour. We are broadcasting on Yagara and Turrbal country, and today on the show we are going to be talking about strategy, activist strategy. I spoke to Holly Hammond, who is a political organiser, a lot of history involved in different political movements, and also a political educator. She has an organisation called Plan to Win, which is about equipping groups of citizens to create the kind of changes that we want to see in our society. And also she's a curator of the Commons Library, which is an online resource of documents that are relevant to how to run a campaign, how to strategize, how to be successful in changing the world. There's a few little things that you might find in that library that I wrote too that have snuck their way in there. But yeah, I spoke to Holly about strategy, and I think it's important too because as it come out in this interview, I think often reporting on either politics or political activism is just this basis on these are events that happened, and it's like it's happened in a vacuum. But actually investigating why people did certain events, or what's the relevance, or how they're responding to different things, is not necessarily what mainstream media does, and it's not always what activist media does, because we just have this idea of news being this reporting of events. And so I think we're not always encouraged to think strategically about why people are doing the things they're doing. And even within the political movement, sometimes the education for that isn't very good. And so I've been wanting for a while actually to do a show just to talk about strategy, what it looks like and how to think strategically. And so that's a bit of what today's show is going to be about. I think it's also important because we've just come from a week of politics and a few weeks of politics here in Queensland, and then if people are following world news, where I guess people are a bit despairing about the current state of politics around the world. And the thing is that these elections, they're democratic, it's people are voting for what they want, and sometimes we just need to accept the fact that the world is a certain way, and if we want it to be different, we're going to have to somehow be part of making that change. And so we've got to think about how are we going to do that? How are we going to make the changes that we want to see? I mean, despair, it's valid, it's a valid response, but it's not, in itself, it won't change the situation. And so despair is okay, but let's also think about how can we organise, how can we act, how can we change our thinking to try to impact the world, to make it a bit more the place we want it to be, and a bit more a place that enables the flourishing of everybody's lives, which our world doesn't necessarily do. So anyway, talking to Holly today about strategy will be a little bit of that kind of thinking. Let's get into that interview.
Hi Andy, I'm Holly Hammond from the Commons Social Change Library.
Holly, today we are talking about strategy, which is an interesting topic. It's a broad term, and it's something that maybe doesn't get focused on as much in political media as it could. With a sort of immediate short-term focus that so often drives media. So I'm interested in starting off, because you're a sort of activist educator. Let's start off with a bit of a definition of what is strategy.
Sure. For me, strategy is just a path that takes you from where you are to where you want to be. And that defining that path can be quite simple or it can be quite complicated, but there is an intentional kind of orientation to change something where we're moving from the situation as it is to the situation how we want it to be. And that's what our intention is when we define a strategy for social change.
And so I guess a lot of people, they see something wrong in the world and they maybe go to a rally or sign a petition, or maybe they do something more dramatic like go and get arrested doing direct action or something. Are these examples of a strategy? And if not, like what would be an example of a strategy?
So I think of a strategy as not just being a one-off action. It's usually when we're talking about a campaign, it's a series of actions over a period of time focused towards achieving particular goals and involving different people in those actions. So, you know, as an individual, if I care about something, I will be moved to act because I want to see the change happen. And I might think by signing this petition or attending this rally, I'm having some influence in the direction that I want things to go. But just the solitary action isn't going to achieve the outcome that we want. So in terms of, groups that are running campaigns, often, there is a strategy there, but it might not be clearly articulated. So people might, for example, reach for the tactics they already know how to do and do them again, rather than kind of analysing, will this make a difference on the issue that they're trying to change? So strategy is really about a considered process where you really get to know the lay of the land as it is now, what's going on and what all the different factors are. And you get clear with your vision about how you want things to be. And then there's a process of, it's a combination of kind of right brain and left brain in terms of we are, trying to be analytical and well-informed and logical in developing a plan, but we're also being creative. There's the visioning side of things is imaginary because we're trying to look into a future that we're trying to create. So we're kind of bringing those two parts together.
One of the workshops that is often done to get people thinking about strategy is, a theory of change, and for different people to think about how they think that social change happens. Is this a good example of how to get things strategically? And I guess what are some different theories of how change happens?
Yeah, I think it can be really productive for groups to spend time working through theory of change, and for individuals to get clearer about what their theory of change is. It can be really empowering, actually, to put time into getting more of a picture of, how we think change happens in the world and what we can do that's going to make an impact on that. So, when we're thinking about theory of change, it brings up a lot of different things. So there might be, how our assumptions about how power operates in society, the role of institutions and government, the kind of tensions between different stakeholders in society. When we're exploring theory of change, we can kind of dig into all of that kind of stuff. Some theories of change that we see out there, just to give a sense of differences. So some folks might think that disruptive direct action is the way to move things forward, while others think that doing the inside track work of influencing government is the way to move things forward. The interesting thing is that in social movements, then there's often a lot of tension between people who have those two views, but really change can often come about through the combination of people working with those different theories of change. So the disruptive direct action puts the issue on the agenda in society, and people are engaging with it and paying attention to it. And meanwhile, the people who have, the connections with power holders are in their ear advocating for particular reforms. So, thinking about theory of change can also bring up where we sit in the ecology of a social movement, the different role that we play and how we can play that well.
Yeah, that does bring up an interesting point. You mentioned that broader movements and this idea of movement ecology. What does it mean to think of yourself as not the be-all and end-all of a strategy and how it might change, but as part of a movement?
I think that can be really liberating. I think when we are really committed to creating a change in the world, it can sit really heavily on our shoulders. Whereas if we're able to see, well, there's many people who care about getting to that outcome, but they might be taking different paths. It kind of means, well, if you don't feel well suited to lobbying politicians, there's other people who do that really well. It's in their strength. If you want to be building collective power, with other people, and building groups up so they can grow and more people can come in and take action, like that's going to be a really amazing contribution. Or if the thing that energises you and excites you is the those actions where you're really right there on the front line, that's a contribution that you can make. We can spend a lot of time trying to persuade other people to adopt our theory of change, whereas actually understanding the contributions that others make and working well with it, that can make the difference. So on the Common Social Change Library, we've got a great resource that's very popular, which is Bill Moyer's 4 Roles of Social Activists. And he defined citizens, reformers, rebels and change agents as these 4 roles in movements, who all have a really meaningful contribution to make, but also that those roles can be played effectively and ineffectively. So in some ways, getting to know where you sit and then also how to play your role effectively can be really great. There's more awareness about how you're acting yourself, but then also how you are in relationship with others in social movements.
There's another sort of dichotomy in there that you touched on, that maybe one course of action is a very short-term thing, media-worthy action that puts things into the discourse, but then there's maybe other ways of thinking about the long-term, trying to create change that can last and trying to work through institutions which maybe work a bit slower. I guess... do you want to talk about the merits of short-term thinking and long-term thinking, whether one's more strategic than the other or whether they're both important?
Yeah, I think there's a place for both. And that's also why it's great that we have different kinds of people all active in social change, because they're going to bring different perspectives. Like I was saying before, some people might be more analytical, others might be more creative, some people might be like fast-paced and others might take the long view. I'd say, often we are looking for where the opportunities are to create change and things open up. There's moments where it's like, oh, if we press now, we're going to move forward really quickly. The Engler brothers wrote this great book, This is an Uprising, and they talk about the moment of the whirlwind, when an issue really takes off and suddenly, like, it's what everybody's talking about and there's all this fresh energy at that takeoff moment. And sometimes movements kind of miss that opportunity and they don't manage to build from there. Sometimes, there's a big flashy action, but there was no infrastructure to catch any of the people so they could go on to keep being involved in taking action. We do see that it really takes time to make change. So we can have these big moments of kind of energy and enthusiasm, but it's probably going to take a number of those over time, these little peaks and troughs in movements, before we get to the places that we really want to be getting to.
I guess one of the things that is often discussed when talking about activist strategy is a differentiation between strategy and tactics. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that and why that's important? Sure.
So with strategy, I've talked about where we are now, where we're trying to go, which is kind of our big vision, and then our goals that we're trying to achieve, and then objectives being the smaller steps on the way to those goals and that vision. And tactics are what we do to take those steps. We do them to try to move along the path of the strategy. So, there's a broad array of tactics that people use, doing petition drive, holding rallies, creative stunts, seminars and educational things that help people understand the issue. Lots of different tactics that we can use. So often what we find with activists is that we jump straight to tactics. Like we're really excited, we want to make change, and so we just start thinking about the actions that we could take, and we get together with a group of other people and we go, okay, let's do that thing. And if you haven't done any other strategic work, you know, you can end up putting a heap of energy into something that's not going to have an impact. Like it might be a tactic that's not accessible for the people you want to involve. You know, it could alienate key allies that you were wanting to cultivate. It might be something that's just not going to have any impact on the decision maker you're trying to influence. So I always really encourage people to kind of slow down, don't just jump to tactics. But if you find you have gotten that place, there are some tools you can use as well. So there's a great strategic tool called the Tactic Star, which helps you assess the worth of different tactics, and it kind of gets you to be strategic in reverse. So it'll ask you, you know, what's this tactic going to do in terms of influencing a decision maker? What's the kind of vibe of it, the emotional tone it's going to set? How will it affect the allies you want to work with? What's the story that's going to be told if you use this tactic? And so that's a way to kind of work with the energy of people being really excited and enthusiastic to take action, but also then giving some filters to make that as strategic as possible.
I think one of the things about strategy is that corporations do it very well in their own way, not for social change necessarily, but to have a strong idea of what they want to do and how they can get there. And other sort of big institutions like political parties, and I suppose in the social change sphere, it sometimes moves into the kind of non-governmental organisations, have this idea of strategy. But sometimes it seems to me that the more grassroots activist groups are a bit more kind of in the moment focused and a bit less encouraged to think strategically. Do you think that's true?
I mean, I know a lot of grassroots folks who are really strategic and have been involved in movements for years and years and kind of bring their insights from past action into their current work. I don't think the size of your organisation, you know, is a determinant of how strategic you are. I think it's interesting what you're sort of saying about corporations. They often have a lot of clarity about their plans, and sometimes it can be helpful for us to kind of put ourselves in their shoes. So, for example, if they're trying to get approval for a coal mine, we can look at like what are the various steps they have to go through in order for that coal mine to happen. So we're like, are we going to intervene at this consultation period time? Are we going to do a legal action to try to stop it from happening? Are we going to go and lock on with our bodies to stop the ground being broken? These different points where that we can intervene in, it can be really helpful to kind of look at it from the other side. But yeah, I think there's lots of scope for small grassroots groups to engage with strategy. You know, they may already be doing that, but it might not be articulated. So having moments to pause, reflect on how things are going, look at what's being learnt, and then decide on like the next phase of action. You know, that's strategy. That's a strategic process.
What about for people that they're aiming for quite a radical transformation of society? And I think you and I would probably agree that we would like to see a lot of things change quite dramatically in the world. How does it work to think strategically about that if where you want to get is like, you know, 1,000,000 steps up the ladder? Should you still be thinking strategically about how to get there?
Definitely. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting thing. So we can have a very lofty goal, and then there's incremental changes that might happen along the way. So if we're putting a lot of pressure on a particular target to change in a big way, if they're feeling that pressure, they might start to offer concessions. So they're like, oh, we'll have a quota, or we'll put some more money into it, or we'll have a review period, or whatever the different things are. They are kind of aiming to demobilise the movement by doing that. They're like, hey, we gave you a concession, stop hassling us. We can still go, oh, look, we're glad we got some change. You know, we can see we're making an impact, but we're still holding out for those bigger shifts that we want. And I think that kind of comes up. People sometimes talk about transformational or transformative reforms. So, you know, reforms can kind of be a small incremental change has happened and now the momentum's gone and nothing more is happening, or reforms can kind of open up a space for bigger change. So, and that's really also about how people make sense of wins and losses.
There is a funny thing in the media and how it reports on politics broadly and the news, in that it's just like, this thing happened, now this thing happened, now this thing happened. And it doesn't often kind of report on things from a strategic lens or necessarily encourage very strategic thinking. Do you think that that's an issue in, I guess, educating about strategy, and what can be done to counter that?
Yeah, I think what we often find is where we have managed to shift a power holder, a politician or a corporation, and they've made a change, is that very rarely is anyone going to say, oh, it's because of the activists. So we need to do our own political education and connect with our history, learn the lessons from our history and share those stories, because we're not going to get it in the mainstream media, probably not going to get it in the textbook at school. So making sure, when a change happens, we make the connection to collective action and what people did that made a difference. And there's a lot of really inspiring stories from the past that the Commons, we're often sharing that history with people to help them understand, these changes came about because of collective action.
Yeah, and that is one of your big projects, is the Commons Library, which is trying to collect together resources about social change, and a part of that is really trying to document wins and kind of strategic resources. Do you want to tell us a bit more about what you do at the Commons Library and why you think it's important?
Sure. Well, the Commons Library, commonslibrary.org, is a place where we gather the collective wisdom of people engaged in social change, and we take a really broad approach to that. So we were talking before about different theories of change. In the Commons, you'll find resources about lobbying and advocacy and nonviolent direct action and digital campaigning and ways to use the media. Lots of different approaches and lots of different skill sets for social change are included in the Commons. But yeah, definitely we're also looking at we gather case studies of past campaigns so people can learn from those. And we have a lot of resources on strategy. We have a large kind of start here guide on campaign strategy, which includes, really introductory articles around strategy, but then a whole heap of tools to do different aspects of strategy. So as I was saying before, when you're defining that path, you want to feel really clear about where you are right now. So we've got tools for doing, stakeholder analysis, where do people stand, power analysis. We've got visioning tools. We've got defining your goals so that you come up with meaningful goals and objectives that you can reach, all these different tools to do that. And then tools for also deciding what action fits for the things you're trying to achieve. So, how to develop tactics that will be really engaging for people to be involved in and will also put pressure where you want it to go.
All right, well, if people are listening to this and they're people that believe that the world could be better and that there's something we could do to get us there, I guess what would you suggest is a good way to start for an individual or a group to start thinking strategically?
I think for an individual, probably if you want to be involved in creating change, is to look around and see what already exists, what groups are doing, and then see which ones align with your interests and your energy and your theory of change. And, if you want to be approaching things more strategically, there can be a lot of value in checking out resources like on the Commons Library or reading books around what people have done in the past. I mentioned This Is an Uprising. That's a really great educational book. There's also a book called Strategy and Soul, which tells the story of anti-casino campaigns in Philadelphia, but does it in a really great, engaging way and has a lot of it's very educational. For groups, I think it's about making the time together. So intentionally setting up planning time where you sit down with other people in your team and you think about, what's our vision, what are our values that guide us, who was our base, like who are the people that we're working with, and how could we get more people involved, what would that look like? And then doing, some strategic assessment of different tactic options. There's a tool called critical path analysis, which is really about defining your path, and that can really help a group work through, get clearer on the objectives, and then what are the tactics that will help to achieve those different objectives.
Is there anything else you'd like to leave us with, Holly?
I think with strategy, it really starts with strategic thinking, and that's something that we can cultivate over time. So we can do it by learning lessons from history. So the more we know about how social change has happened in the past, the more it will help us have ideas about how to create social change in the future. We can do it through reflection and developing our own self-awareness. There's a wonderful approach called strategic questioning, which you can use in lots of different ways in your life. Like you could use it as a group who is developing a strategy, but you also can use it in one-to-one conversations with people. So this was developed by Fran Peavy many years ago, and she defines a whole different set of questions that you can ask. So, for example, a strategic question that might be relevant to something you're working on is, why are things already not how we want them to be? Like, what is holding the current situation in place? That can be a great, spot to do some inquiry. And then asking, what would it take for things to be how we want them to be? And that can help you start to think, oh, right, well, if this shifted in this way, then we'd be getting closer to where we want to go. So let's figure out how we make that shift.
All right. Thanks very much, Holly, for chatting with us today.
No worries, Andy. Great to talk with you. And really encourage people to check out commonslibrary.org, have a little browse of the materials that we've got in the campaign strategy section, and feel free to get in touch with the librarians. Just send us through a message on our contact form. You can also subscribe to our newsletter, and we'll send you new activist resources every month.
All right. Thanks, Holly. You are on 4ZZZ, and we have been speaking with Holly Hammond about activist strategy. Holly, as she did mention, the Commons Library is a resource that she helps to curate of case studies, I guess, of how we can get together and organise successfully for a better world. It's a little one step at a time, of course. Unfortunately, it's a long slog, and sometimes it feels like we're going backwards, and sometimes it feels like we just don't have the power to take on these immense systems around us. But that's where, I guess, strategic thinking comes in, and analytical thinking, trying to figure out what's going on and where there are opportunities, using the abilities that we have, and where there's sort of the potential for change in the world around us. And so I hope you have found it useful today, listening to Holly talk about activist strategy. And I think it's so important for political media to talk not just about what's going on, and of course at the moment there's a lot of things going on in the world, but to equip us to think about why they're like that and how they could be different. And so that's what I try to do each week on the Paradigm Shift. And so keep tuning in, and together we'll work on how to make a better world in the best way that we can. Always a work in progress, as it's never finished. There'll always be negotiating between people. I'll see you next week.